The courtroom was packed, every inch of space filled with anticipation. The faint smell of polished wood mixed with the musky scent of worn leather seats. The overhead lights flickered occasionally, casting a cold, sterile glow over the room. In the back, the public murmured amongst themselves, eagerly awaiting the trial of a man accused of breaking into a home, leaving the small town in shock. Samantha Harris, a 15-year-old girl with auburn hair and pale green eyes, sat nervously on the witness stand. Her hands trembled, clutching the leash of her service dog, Buster, a golden retriever with a calm demeanor that contrasted sharply with her anxious movements. She was young, but she had already faced more than most adults could bear. The entire town of Alderbrook, a place where crime rarely touched, was stunned by what had happened. The burglary at Samantha's home was a bizarre one. No windows were broken, no locks were tampered with, yet valuable items had vanished in the dead of night. The only potential witness? Samantha and Buster, her loyal canine companion who had been by her side through countless emotional challenges. Judge Claire Morrison, a woman with an ironclad reputation for fairness and objectivity, sat high above the room, her sharp gaze scanning the proceedings. She had seen it all: robberies, assaults, and even more gruesome cases, but this one was different. The young girl and her dog seemed out of place in the formal setting of the courtroom, their presence evoking both sympathy and curiosity. Samantha's lawyer, Mark Daniels, leaned in close, speaking gently to her. His voice was low and steady, aiming to calm her nerves. He had worked with children before and understood the fragility of a young witness. "Just take a deep breath, Sam. You don't have to say everything in one go. We're here to find the truth," he whispered, offering a reassuring smile. Samantha nodded, her lips trembling slightly. The trial began. As Mark gently probed for details about the night of the robbery, Samantha's mind raced back to that evening, a night that had started like any other. It was late, and her mother had gone to bed early. Samantha, however, had stayed up, doing her homework, with Buster lying quietly beside her. The house was eerily quiet, except for the occasional creak of the floorboards. As the clock ticked past midnight, an unsettling feeling crept over her. Buster, usually calm and collected, had been acting strange. He paced back and forth, his ears flicking at every noise. Samantha, tired and thinking it was just her imagination, ignored him. But then the low growl came, an unfamiliar sound. Buster stood rigidly by the front door, his eyes fixed on something unseen. His body was tense, but there was no indication of what had caused his behavior. Samantha froze, listening to the silence that followed. "Mom," she whispered, but there was no response. Samantha swallowed hard, gripping the leash tightly. The strange tension in the air seemed to intensify. The growl continued, barely audible at first, then growing louder and more urgent. It was as if Buster knew something Samantha didn't. His alert stance told her this was different. Her heart raced as she heard a faint scraping sound coming from downstairs. Someone, or something, was in the house. Samantha's pulse quickened, and her breath hitched in her throat. She felt Buster's warmth beside her, but his body was tense, his eyes never leaving the hallway. "Buster, stay," she whispered, but Buster was already in motion. He moved towards the door, his body rigid with a focus that Samantha had never seen before. She instinctively followed him, creeping silently towards the door. Then the sound came again, louder now, scraping at the window, followed by the softest shuffle of footsteps. Samantha's heart thundered in her chest, her legs trembling. She wasn't sure if she could make it down the stairs without being heard. Buster's low growl seemed to vibrate through the house. As Samantha crept forward, she raised her hand slightly, just a flick of her wrist, and Buster's posture shifted instantly. He had been trained to respond to subtle hand signals, something her father had taught her after her traumatic experience with the loss of her father years ago. She was used to the quiet companionship of Buster, but this night felt different. As the shadow moved across the floor beneath the door, Buster's growl intensified. He remained silent, his breathing steady, and his eyes narrowed, waiting. Samantha held her breath, the only sound in the house being the beating of her heart and the occasional rustle from the figure below. Then, the shadow retreated. Samantha dared to peek out from behind the door, only to see the figure moving toward the living room. Her body went limp with relief. Whoever it was had gone. But Buster, still on high alert, barked once, sharp and loud, his command echoing through the house as if to say the danger had passed. Samantha collapsed to the ground, tears welling up as she hugged Buster close. He had been her protector, her steady companion in the darkest of times, and tonight, he had kept her safe again. As Samantha spoke these details in court, her voice quivered, but everyone in the room could see it in her eyes. The bond between her and Buster was undeniable. And just when the courtroom seemed to settle into an uneasy silence, something remarkable happened. Samantha paused in her testimony, glancing nervously at Buster, who sat calmly at her feet. Her hands clenched the leash tightly as her fingers played with the fabric, pulling it back and forth in nervousness. Mark Daniels continued to ask her questions, but she was so focused on the courtroom's intensity that she could hardly concentrate on his words. Her father, sitting in the gallery, gave her an encouraging nod, reminding her to stay strong. Judge Claire Morrison, a woman whose reputation for fairness and intellect had earned her respect, leaned forward as Samantha described Buster's behavior that night. She asked Samantha to explain how the dog's reaction had been more than just a response to normal anxiety. It was instinctual, a warning of danger that only Buster seemed to understand. Just as Samantha was about to continue, her lawyer paused, looking at the defendant, the man accused of the burglary, Victor Hughes. A handyman with a history of strange behavior, he was known to have been in the neighborhood around the time of the crime. His unassuming appearance, however, seemed to lend him an aura of innocence, which was exactly what his lawyer was exploiting in the courtroom. Then something extraordinary happened. Buster, who had been calm throughout most of the trial, suddenly stood up and stared directly at Victor Hughes. His posture was rigid, his ears pinned back, and his gaze never wavered from the man. A low growl rumbled from his chest, building in intensity as they drew closer. Buster's behavior was not something that could be ignored. The entire courtroom froze. Buster's bark shattered the silence, loud and demanding. It was as if the dog had recognized something, or someone, he considered a threat. The room went into a stunned silence, and even Judge Morrison sat forward, her expression unreadable. Victor Hughes, who had been seated confidently up until that moment, suddenly froze. His face went pale, and his once arrogant demeanor vanished. He looked around the room, his eyes darting nervously between Buster and the audience. The tension in the air was palpable. The defense attorney tried to maintain control, but it was clear that something had shifted. Judge Morrison called for order, and the room quieted once again. She turned her attention to Samantha. "Can you explain, Miss Harris, what just occurred?" she asked, her voice gentle but firm. Samantha, her heart racing, nodded. "Buster, he's been trained to recognize threats," she explained, her voice a little shaky. "When he growls or barks like that, it's because he senses danger. He did the same thing when a man came to our house a few weeks ago, and he scared me then, too. Buster's just trying to protect me." The defense attorney immediately objected, arguing that a dog's behavior should not be admissible as evidence. However, the damage had already been done. The entire courtroom had witnessed Buster's protective instincts in action, and the subtle unease in Victor Hughes' demeanor was impossible to ignore. The courtroom grew heavy with tension as the defense attorney tried to discredit Samantha's testimony. His voice echoed through the silent room, suggesting that Buster's behavior was merely a coincidence, that any dog would growl if they sensed a stranger's presence. But Samantha stood firm, her hand tightly gripping Buster's leash, his calm presence a stark contrast to the rising unease in the room. She had faith in Buster, and she knew, deep down, that his behavior had been no accident. Victor Hughes, the defendant, sat at the defense table, his expression composed, though the faintest sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead. Every time Buster's gaze shifted toward him, Hughes' body stiffened. His eyes darted nervously between Buster and the prosecutor. It was as if something primal had been triggered in him, a sense of being exposed. Samantha could feel the change in the air, a palpable shift as Hughes' confidence began to erode. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Natalie Moore, pressed on with her questions. She had seen this before, witnesses who were hesitant, unsure, but also brave enough to stand their ground. She knew Samantha was telling the truth. And she also knew that Buster's actions were not to be dismissed so easily. "Mr. Hughes," Moore began, her voice cutting through the murmurs in the room, "we have heard testimony about a dog's protective behavior. Do you deny being present on the night of the burglary?" Hughes, whose smugness had been visible earlier, now squirmed slightly in his seat. His hands gripped the arms of his chair as his gaze flickered toward the jury. His voice, once steady, now faltered. "I was at home," he replied, his tone defensive. "I don't know why the girl is claiming this. I've never even been near her house." Moore, unfazed, continued. "Yet you have a history with theft. You've been accused of such crimes before, haven't you?" She paused for effect. "And now, we have a dog who seems to know exactly who was there that night." Samantha felt a knot form in her stomach. She knew what was coming, but she wasn't prepared for the tension to reach this level. Buster's growl began to build again, low at first, a sound that made the hairs on the back of Samantha's neck stand up. His body shifted slightly, his posture stiffening. This time, the growl was longer, more intense. It wasn't just an instinctual reaction anymore, it was a warning. The entire room was now on edge. The audience's whispers stopped as all eyes turned to Buster, whose gaze was locked directly on Hughes. His growl grew louder, almost a rumble, vibrating through the walls of the courtroom. His tail was taut, and his ears were flattened, signaling something ominous. It wasn't a simple response to a stranger, it was a direct challenge. Hughes looked visibly rattled now. His face went pale, and his eyes widened in disbelief. The swagger he had entered with had evaporated, replaced by something closer to fear. He leaned back in his chair, trying to appear unfazed, but it was clear to everyone that his composure was cracking. Then, without warning, Buster barked. It wasn't the bark of an excited dog, it was a sharp, commanding sound that sliced through the silence of the room. The force of the bark was so sudden and intense that several jurors flinched. It echoed in the courtroom, reverberating off the walls, making even the defense attorney pause in mid-sentence. Buster's bark had effectively silenced the entire room. It was as if he had single-handedly declared that something was wrong, something that no one could ignore. Samantha's heart raced as she watched the stunned faces around her. She felt Buster's tension in her own body, his growl subsiding into a low rumble as his gaze remained fixed on Hughes. There was no question now, Buster knew something that the rest of them hadn't realized. The defense attorney, who had been prepared to tear apart Samantha's testimony, faltered. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. His face turned a shade of red that contrasted sharply with his usual cool demeanor. His eyes flickered toward Hughes, who had now turned a sickly shade of white, unable to meet anyone's gaze. The dog's behavior had thrown everything off balance. Samantha knew that Buster's instincts had just shifted the entire course of the trial. Judge Claire Morrison, ever composed, struck her gavel firmly, demanding order. The courtroom fell silent, but the tension remained thick in the air. She turned to Samantha, her voice softer now. "Miss Harris," the judge said, "please explain what just occurred. Why did your dog react in this way?" Samantha swallowed, her mind spinning, but her voice remained steady as she responded, "Buster, he's trained to detect danger. He only reacts like this when he senses something wrong. His growl, his bark, they mean that something dangerous is near. He's never acted like this around anyone before." Samantha paused, looking down at Buster, who sat perfectly still at her feet. She could feel the weight of the room's eyes on her, but in that moment, she knew Buster was not just a witness, he was the protector. He had known the truth all along. The defense attorney stood up, his face a mask of frustration and disbelief. "Objection, Your Honor," he called out. "We cannot base a verdict on the actions of a dog." Judge Morrison's eyes narrowed as she silenced him with a single motion of her hand. "This court will allow the jury to weigh all the evidence," she replied firmly. "However, we cannot ignore what has just occurred in this room. This is highly unusual, and I will give it due consideration." The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted. There was no denying it anymore. Buster's actions had left everyone uneasy. Even Hughes, who had denied his involvement in the burglary, could no longer hold his composure. The air was thick with doubt, and it was clear that the defense's arguments were starting to crumble. Samantha could feel her pulse racing, but at the same time, a sense of relief began to wash over her. The truth was coming out, piece by piece, and it wasn't just because of her testimony, it was because of Buster's unwavering loyalty, his protective instincts, and his ability to sense the danger that no one else had noticed. This was no ordinary dog. He was the key. With the room still buzzing with whispers, Judge Morrison called for a brief recess, signaling that the case was taking a crucial turn. Samantha's heart hammered in her chest as she glanced down at Buster, silently thanking him for everything. The courtroom was about to witness the unraveling of a truth that no one could deny. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted, thick with tension. The jury was restless, the spectators whispered among themselves, and even the defense attorney, once so confident, seemed unsettled. Samantha Harris sat at the witness stand, Buster by her side, and for the first time since the trial began, she could sense the balance of power tipping in their favor. Her dog, her loyal protector, had made his presence felt in a way no one could deny. Judge Claire Morrison, sensing the weight of the moment, called for a recess, allowing the courtroom to simmer in silence. The door slammed shut behind the judge as she retreated to her chambers, her mind undoubtedly racing through the events that had just transpired. Samantha tried to steady her breath, her pulse still racing from the events that had unfolded so quickly. She glanced down at Buster, who sat by her feet, his ears perked, eyes alert, as though he knew the case was nearing its tipping point. As the recess dragged on, Samantha couldn't help but replay the events in her mind. The low growl. The sharp bark. The way Buster's instincts had taken over in that crucial moment. His actions weren't random, they were deliberate, a warning that the defendant, Victor Hughes, wasn't as innocent as he claimed. She felt a surge of pride in Buster but also a deep unease. They weren't finished yet. There was still so much left to prove. After what felt like an eternity, Judge Morrison returned to the bench, her expression tight with determination. She didn't waste time. "Let's proceed," she declared, her voice firm, commanding the courtroom's attention. "We'll continue with the prosecution. Mr. Calloway, please present the next set of evidence." Simon Calloway, Samantha's lawyer, nodded to the judge, a glimmer of hope now evident in his eyes. His earlier uncertainty had melted away, replaced by the quiet confidence of someone who knew they were on the right path. Calloway stood and turned to the jury, his voice steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, as you've just witnessed, the defendant's behavior and history have become impossible to ignore. We are not just dealing with circumstantial evidence anymore. We are dealing with facts that are coming to light." He turned to Samantha. "Miss Harris, I'd like you to recall the events of that night in greater detail. Can you describe what happened after you heard the noises?" Samantha hesitated for a moment. She could feel Buster's steady presence, his warmth at her side, giving her the strength to continue. She swallowed hard and spoke, her voice clearer now. I was in bed, she began. I couldn't sleep, like usual. And then I heard Buster growl. It wasn't like the usual growl, though. It was deep, low, like something was wrong. She paused, remembering the terror she felt that night. He stood by the door, staring at it. I felt it too, something was out there. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence as Samantha's words hung in the air. Even Hughes, who had been quietly fidgeting with his tie, seemed to tense at the mention of Buster's protective instincts. Buster didn't just react to sounds, Samantha continued, her gaze fixed on the jury. He knew. He was trying to warn me, to protect me. When I heard the noise again, I signaled to him. I told him to stay close. And he did. He was my shield. There was a collective murmur in the courtroom. Some of the spectators looked at each other, nodding, as though they were beginning to understand the unspoken bond between Samantha and her dog. Even the jury seemed to lean in, their attention fixed on Samantha's testimony. "And what happened after you signaled to Buster?" Calloway asked, his voice low, coaxing her to recount the crucial details. Samantha felt her heart race as she recalled the moment the intruder had stepped closer to the door. "The shadow," she whispered. "I saw it move past the crack under the door. And then Buster barked. A loud, sharp bark. He was warning them. Warning whoever was out there." The courtroom hung on her words as she continued. "When I heard the noise again, I thought I was going to pass out. But Buster stayed by me, not leaving my side for a second. When the shadow finally moved away, Buster didn't stop. He kept barking, kept alerting. And when it was over, I felt a little bit safer, even though I was scared." As Samantha finished, she could see the impact her words had on the room. There was no question now. Buster wasn't just a pet. He was a protector, a vital witness to the truth. Calloway nodded, giving her a reassuring smile before turning to the defense. The next moments were crucial. The defense lawyer, now looking visibly uncomfortable, stood and attempted to refute Samantha's testimony. "Objection, Your Honor," he called. "This is simply an interpretation of a dog's behavior. There is no concrete proof linking the dog's actions to the defendant." Judge Morrison didn't immediately respond. Instead, she turned her attention to Buster, watching him closely. His eyes were locked on Hughes again, the calmness of his demeanor at odds with the tension in the room. There was no denying it, Buster's behavior was more than just instinct, it was a signal, a response to something the dog had recognized. And that recognition, Samantha realized, was the key to unraveling the truth. "Your Honor," Calloway interjected, his voice calm but with a sense of urgency, "I would like to call upon Dr. Samuel Farley, an expert in animal behavior. He can speak to the significance of Buster's actions and how they align with what we know about a dog's instincts." Judge Morrison considered this for a moment before nodding. "Proceed, Mr. Calloway." A chill ran down Samantha's spine as Dr. Farley took the stand, the weight of his credentials apparent. He was a man known for his expertise in working dogs, specifically in detecting criminal activity. His presence was a clear message, the courtroom was ready to take Buster's role seriously. As Dr. Farley spoke, he detailed how Buster's behavior was consistent with a dog trained to detect danger. He explained that a dog's heightened senses, particularly their ability to detect fear, anxiety, and guilt in humans, could trigger protective instincts in situations like the one Samantha had described. The room grew quiet as the implications of this expert testimony sank in. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together. Buster had recognized something that no one else had. His growl, his bark, his protective stance, they weren't random. They were a response to a presence that had no place in Samantha's home. As Dr. Farley finished, the courtroom was filled with an eerie sense of anticipation. Hughes shifted uneasily in his seat, and Samantha felt the weight of the moment. The truth was slowly, surely, coming into focus. The courtroom was electric with tension as the final pieces of the case began to fall into place. Judge Morrison leaned forward, her sharp eyes locked on the defendant, Victor Hughes. Samantha sat at the witness stand, her hands still holding onto Buster's leash. Buster, ever vigilant, sat beside her, his gaze fixed on Hughes. It was clear now, there was no escape from the truth. As the defense tried once more to dismiss the evidence, the weight of the testimony was undeniable. Dr. Farley's expert analysis had confirmed what Samantha and Buster had already known: the dog's actions were no coincidence. Buster had recognized the danger that night. His protective instincts had led him to alert Samantha to the presence of the intruder, and now, those instincts were bringing the truth into the light. Victor Hughes shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His earlier bravado had long since evaporated. The case against him was unraveling, and with each new revelation, his confidence seemed to wane. The defense attorney attempted to argue that Buster's growl and bark couldn't be trusted as valid evidence, but the judge had heard enough. "Mr. Hughes," Judge Morrison began, her voice calm but stern, "it is clear that your actions on the night of the burglary were not accidental. The evidence points directly to you, and no amount of objections will change that." The courtroom fell silent, the weight of her words settling over everyone like a heavy blanket. Hughes' face went pale, and for the first time, he seemed to realize the magnitude of his situation. Samantha could feel the shift in the room. The power had finally shifted in their favor. Buster's actions had spoken louder than words ever could, and now, the truth was undeniable. With a deep breath, she stood tall, her voice steady. "I know what happened that night," she said, her words strong. "And I know that Buster saved me. He knew the truth before anyone else." The jury, who had been listening intently, exchanged glances. The evidence was overwhelming now. The torn cloth, the crowbar, and the growing tension in the room had all pointed to the same conclusion. It was Victor Hughes who had been inside Samantha's home. His guilt was no longer a question. Judge Morrison nodded, turning to the jury. "The facts are clear. This trial is concluded." As the courtroom erupted into murmurs, Samantha felt a sense of closure wash over her. The journey had been long, and the fear had been constant, but she had never been alone. Buster had been by her side every step of the way. And now, thanks to his unwavering loyalty, the truth had been revealed. Victor Hughes was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, his face a mask of defeat. As he disappeared through the doors, Samantha couldn't help but feel a surge of gratitude for the dog who had been her protector, her guide, and her best friend. Later that day, outside the courthouse, Samantha walked alongside Buster, her father beside her. The world felt a little brighter now. Justice had been served, and they could finally begin to move forward, knowing they had uncovered the truth. Samantha looked down at Buster and smiled. "We did it, boy. We really did it." Buster wagged his tail in response, his loyalty unwavering. Together, they had faced the darkness, and together, they had brought the light. The story of Samantha and Buster delivers a profound lesson about loyalty, courage, and the strength of the bond between humans and animals. It shows that sometimes, four-legged companions can become protectors and crucial witnesses in difficult situations. Buster's presence not only brought safety to Samantha but also helped reveal the truth, emphasizing that trust in instinct and the connection between humans and animals can change the outcome of a case. The greatest lesson is that we should never underestimate sincere relationships and the impact they can have in overcoming challenges and seeking justice.